We've got a family heirloom in the shop for one of our customers. This was her mother's hope chest, and my guess is that it's probably late 60s, early 70s, made by Ethan Allen. It's maple, and it's been dye stained a reddish maple color, and the customer wants to have a darker color. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this apart, remove some nails that were put in to repair it over the years. We're going to replace some skirting that's broken over here, and then we're going to convert this into a toy box for their granddaughter. So follow along as we take this chest apart and convert it to a toy box for a wonderful little girl. So as we slowly disassemble this, we can see that there's some quarter round molding around three sides. It's actually missing on this side. So we're going to take out the moldings that are here, and then we'll replace the one that is missing on the side. And they're just held in with finish nails. They've got mitered corners. So now with those quarter rounds removed, I should be able to just lift this bottom right out, and we did. So this disassembly has gone pretty well. So interesting, there's some other support pieces here that have gone by the wayside, and we'll replace those as well. There's definitely supports here, but these are some nice 3/4 inch blocks. These are just little strips that were placed, and we'll put some sturdier blocks here to be able to support that. While removing nails from the leg of the front of the chest, there was a split here caused by the nails, and each of these pieces cleanly broke off. So what we're going to need to do is re-glue these pieces back together again and then reattach them to the cabinet. So it's going to be a multi-step glue up. We'll glue these first, and then once that's set, we'll then glue it on to the face of the cabinet. The other thing you may notice is there's a curvature to this that we're probably not going to be able to get out, and I don't want to plane it because it will negatively affect the actual cabinet itself. So once we get the finish stripped off of it, what we'll do is we'll soak it down, put it in clamps, see if we can flatten it a little bit. But the other thing that I've noticed is the curvature is happening at each of the seams. So there's some gentle splits here that are really caused by the nails that we're putting into the cabinet. So we're gonna have to figure out what we're gonna do with this, but our next step is gonna be to glue up these broken leg pieces. So this is gonna be a multi-step glue up. First, what we're gonna do is shoot some glue down into these cracks and then squeeze it together, and then we'll mount these together. They're pretty clean breaks, so we're going to use Titebond 2 glue. There's some good tension with this so that I'm not overly concerned about it not holding. And because, as I've mentioned in other videos, it can be a little bit chilly here in the shop. So what I did to reduce the viscosity of the glue is I actually set this in a bottle, a jar of hot water, just to thin the glue a little bit, warm it up so that it gets down into those crevices just a little bit easier. And then to really get it in, I'm going to use my little syringe. I can squirt it right down in there. There we go. Get some good squeeze out there. That means we got the glue down in nice and tight into that crack. While we wait for those repairs to dry, we're going to start stripping this piece. And I use a chemical stripper whenever I do any stripping. I use an old chip brush. I have some scrapers that I use, and I've got an old putty knife that I use as well to scrape off the stuff that's here. So the trick with using any type of stripper is you want to keep a wet edge, because there are evaporants in the stripper as well as wax. So the wax is used to prevent the stripper from evaporating, or to slow the evaporation of the stripper. But we're just going to apply it. We're probably going to wait about 10 or 15 minutes. And this looks to be a lacquer and dyed finish that's on the front of the chest or across the entire chest. So we're going to put it on, let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes. And as you can see, I'm keeping that wet edge across the whole piece. One of the things that will be interesting to see is there's definitely some red tones in the lacquer that's on here. So the question is going to be, were the red tones dyed into the wood before it was sealed with a finish, or was the red tones part of the lacquer? And we'll find that out once we start to scrape this stuff off. So before I glue this leg back onto the face of this chest, I want to do a dry fit to see how well the leg fits. And when I look from this side, I can see light. When I look from this side, I see a gap. So I'm not going to be able to use PVA glue to make this repair, because I need to be able to fill that gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up some colored epoxy to glue this together. And then that way it will fill in the gaps, but then also have a nice strong leg to it. These clamps in the front are keeping this piece flat, and then this is applying pressure down. So I'm going to leave this one on when I take the leg off to apply the epoxy, and then I'll put this one back and then clamp it down. I know that I'm going to be staining this toy box a dark color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix in some dark burnt umber that will match up with what the future stain will be. At least it'll blend in pretty well. So I'm just mixing out even amounts of resin and hardener. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the burnt umber to the resin, and then mix them all together. And what this does, it just hides the repair that we're doing. So I'm just mixing it up, giving it even consistency. And making sure that the burnt umber gets mixed in there. And this is really the best way to be able to hide a repair that you're making. All right. So I'm going to put it on both mating surfaces. We'll get it into clamps, and then we'll let this sit overnight to let the resin completely harden. And again, I'm using the epoxy because there are going to be gaps here, and the epoxy resin will fill that gap. A PVA glue will not. The other thing is this clamp block that's here, I actually have a piece of packing tape, clear packing tape on it, because the resin will not stick to that clear packing tape. And then that way it would be easier to get that clamp block off without it being stuck to the surface. All right. So again, these clamps that are here are to keep the face flat. And then I'm going to apply the pipe clamp in order to get that downward pressure that I'm looking for. So I got some good squeeze out, which tells me that my gap is going to be filled. And I'll clean that up now so that I'm not trying to clean epoxy later on, which is an absolute nightmare to try and clean off. All right, so we've made our repair. I've made sure I've got a good alignment here. I've got a good alignment here. If it's off just a little bit, we'll adjust it with some sanding. And if there is any gap when we're done, we'll fill it with a wax stick. But we're going to let this now sit 24 hours, let the epoxy cure, and we should have a good solid repair made to this leg. So we've gone through and we've applied stripper to all the pieces. And now what I want to do is go through and do a wash off of the stripper that's on here. Now the stripper that I'm using says that it does not need an after wash, but I'm a firm believer that you need it because there's wax in the stripper that prevents it from evaporating too quickly. So I want to go through and I want to remove any of that wax that's there, but then also remove some of the remaining lacquer that might be on here. So I just brush it on, let it sit for a little bit. and I'll come back with a cloth and rub it out. But by applying the lacquer thinner on here, it loosens any of the existing lacquer that's left. And then after this, we'll come through and we'll do a sanding, and we'll use the random overall sander for it. That will actually sand it with 80, then 100, and then we'll come back and we'll hand sand with 120. So you can tell I've already done this with a couple of the other sides. You can see that the red dye is coming out. So there's definitely some lacquer left on the piece. And the other thing is I can feel the wax as I come through. You see it's just coming right off. I can feel the wax as it's lifting off. So that's why I'd rather be safe than sorry and do the after wash, regardless of what the can says. It's a step that I like to take, and it prevents any finish issues later on, because a finish will not adhere to a waxy surface. The other thing is, most of the color that was in this chest, that reddish tone, was in the lacquer, so that I'm getting down to pretty much bare wood, but there's still some pink tones that are in here that we may need to tone them out when we do the stain. Now, the good side of that is that the customer wants a dark stain on this, so the dark will hide that pink pretty well. But if need be, we can come back with a spray toner and neutralize that pink. So whatever lacquer is left, it is wiping right off. And then we're also going to sand this, so if there's any remaining lacquer after that, it will be removed during the sanding process. There's definitely some back here. Let me get some more lacquer thinner. Now the bottom, which I've already stripped and sanded, is sitting over on the other side of the shop, and it has a nasty bow in it. So I'm not sure I'm going to get the bow completely out of it. And the good part is it's the bottom that sits in the chest, so it won't be too bad. So eventually we'll flatten out. But to make the glue up a little bit easier, what I did was I soaked up a towel with water, and I just have some clamps and weights on it to see if I can flatten a little bit. So the moisture content before I put the towel on it was just about 7%. So I'll use that as my baseline after a few days to see if, one, we get all the moisture out, and two, to see if it flattens at all. So I'm going to keep going through here, remove what I can of the wax and lacquer that's on here, and then we're going to come back and give it a sand. We've made some good progress on stripping the old finish off of this blanket chest. The top is done, the side's done, the front is done, and the process I went through is I used stripper, removed the old varnish, and then I went through with some lacquer thinner and cleaned it off. And then I gave it a sand with the random overall sander at 80, then 100. And then I'm going to do a final hand sand with 120 grit. So one of the legs on the front of the toy chest is broken, so we're going to have to replace it. Luckily, we have the other side that we can actually trace one of the legs and put it in there. So if I determine the best way to do this is, because this break is uneven, is I'm going to cut it down flush, glue in a block with the profile that I need. make the repair, and then we'll blend it when it comes to stain it. So first step is going to be for us to trace the leg, have it match this, and then we'll bring it over to the bandsaw and cut the profile for that bottom of that leg. So our best option here is to find a straight cut, and this is slightly on a curve, so I'm going to come to the farthest point, draw a line across, and that's where we're going to make our cut. And then if it's off, we'll blend that all in. So we're going to put a saw cut straight down, the depth of this, and then come across with the saw and cut this off flush. So I've got a block clamped on here that is level with this side. So now I'm going to come across, use this block as a leverage point. With that piece removed, we've gone through and we've chiseled it out to smooth it. And we're going to do a little bit of sanding with it as well too, to get it perfectly flush. With a little bit of a dip here, but I'll have plenty of gluing surface here. So on the back side of this, I'll just fill that up with some epoxy. But we're going to just sand this out smooth, and then we'll start the process of making a match to go in to match the other leg. So this is the matching leg side for the chest. And what I've done is I've clamped a block on and I've aligned it with the feet as well as to the edge. So what I'm going to do is, now that it's clamped, I'm going to trace this piece. And it's a little bit larger on the concave than I need, but that's okay. Because I can always cut off any excess. So with this cut or traced, we'll be able to take this clamp off now, line it up for this other piece. And order of operation is going to be important for this. So let me take it off, let me show you. So here's our cutout. So we've got a straight cut here, and then the curvature. But also, I need to be able to account for a rabbet on here. So I'm not going to be able to put a piece through the table saw or through the router that is that small. So while I have the bigger piece, I'm going to cut my rabbet now, and then come back to the bandsaw and cut out this profile. We've got our pattern traced, so now we're going to go over to the bandsaw and we're going to make a series of cuts to be able to get the profile for the leg. Now when I cut this profile, I cut it proud to the line, so it gives me a little bit excess material so that when I glue it on, I can then shape it and get it to the profile that I'm looking for. So it's success. It's a little bit proud on the edge, a little bit proud here, and I'll be able to use a rasp and blend this all together. But we've got the right direction for all of this. So what I'm going to do now is get some PVA glue and glue that leg on, and then we'll do some flush up trimming once the glue has set. And our piece is in place. We use some PVA glue to get it set. And what we'll do is once it's dry, we'll bring it in here with a rasp to round that out. And then a little bit of the protrusion here, we'll bring that down with a block plane, and we'll bring down this with the block plane as well too. But we've got the right shape. Just a matter of now letting the glue dry So we're getting ready for the glue up of this Hope Chest / toy box. We've gone through, we've done our best that we could to flatten out the big pieces. We have applied some wood filler to where there were a gazillion nails put into it. We've made a patch to this bottom leg. And now we're going to get ready to do a glue up. We did a dry fit before off camera and it came up perfectly square. So now we're going to use Hyde glue to join it all together. And I debated whether or not I should use a Type-On 2 glue or a Hyde glue. And I went onto the Type-On website and I checked the tensile strength of the Hyde glue versus the PVA glue. And as you know, I'm a big fan of using Hyde glue because it's reversible. And the tensile strength of the Type-On 2 versus the Hyde glue was almost identical. So we're going to use the Hyde glue because we know that the joint's going to need to be reversible for future generations repair. And we've got it sitting in the sink right now in a tub of hot water just to reduce the viscosity so it will flow a little bit better. But now we're going to move on to the glue up phase. So our glue up is complete. One of the first things we did, we put the base in the bottom to help square up the bottom. We've got corner blocks cornered at the top. We've got pipe clamps with some glue blocks pulling the sides in. And then to get some of the twist out of the top, we've got these long pipe clamps on to bring it as close to square as possible. Remember that this back and the sides, the front and the back were not perfectly flat. So there was a twist to them still, or a cup. So getting it to be a perfect square is pretty close to impossible. But we're within 1/8 of an inch across the square of it. And once we have the top on, that's only going to be a 1/16 of an inch on either side for reveal. So we'll be in good shape. It's the closest we're going to get. We're going to let this sit in clamps overnight, allow the glue to cure. Then we'll take the clamps off, clean up the old glue, and then start staining the toy chest. We're on to the next phase, which is to stain. Get a coat of stain on this toy box. Remember, we stripped it down, we sanded it to 120, we glued it up, and then I spent the morning removing any glue drips from the glue up, and that's important that you remove those glue ups, any glue drips that you have, because stain will not stick to glue, and you'll actually see a smear of stain. It just won't look right. So you want to make sure that you clean all that old glue up, and then give it a final sand of 120. A lot of folks you'll see go to 220 or 300 when they sand before they stain. And what they're actually doing when they sand that high is polishing the wood. And when you do that, there's no place for the pigments of the stain to bind to the wood. So I typically go to 120, 150, then apply my stain. Now, if you're going to be applying a lacquer, where your color is going to be in the lacquer, you can absolutely sand to 220, because the lacquer just lays on top. But we're actually going to be putting stain on the piece, so that's why we limited it at 120, 150. So on to the next phase, which now is to get a coat of stain on. One of the things I did was I brought a sample board to the customer and gave her a variety of stains to choose from. And she wanted something that was dark to go along with the rest of the decor of her house. And she went with this middle one, which is a special walnut. So that's going to be on the exterior. I recommended something light for the interior so that the little girl could see her toys. The maple was a little bit too orangey, so she went with a cherry color. So I used a piece of birch plywood, which is the same as this birch, applied the stain to it so we know what the color tone is going to look like. So let's move on now and apply those coats of stain. After letting the stain sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, we then went back and wiped it with a clean cloth to make sure there were no drips and get even coverage across the entire chest. Our next step is to apply a coat of satin polyurethane to all the sides, the top, as well as the inside of the cabinet. After the first coat of polyurethane dried, we then gave the entire chest a light sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper. And it's careful here that we're sanding with the grain and sanding very lightly, because really the objective here is to remove any dust nubs or imperfections in that first coat of polyurethane. We then apply a second coat of the satin polyurethane across the entire chest and then allow that to dry before we move on to the next step. Once the second coat of polyurethane dried, we then wiped down the entire chest with some 4-aught steel wool. Then we applied a coat of paste wax, buffed out the paste wax, then reinstalled the original hinges, then also installed a pair of soft close hinges. The hope chest / toy box conversion is complete. If you remember, this was an old hope chest that dated back to the late 60s, early 70s. It was made by Ethan Allen up in Vermont, and it was in some pretty rough shape. The top was cupped, the sides were cupped, the bottom was cupped. So we completely stripped down the entire piece. We took it apart first, and we found 27 nails that were holding in the sides. And we also had to do some repair work. One of the first pieces of repair work we had to do was this back piece had broken off. So we glued that back on. We then also had to make a replacement leg for here. And we also had to make a replacement quarter round for the inside. We stripped the piece down, put a dark coat of stain on the outside, a lighter coat of stain on the inside, applied 2 coats of satin polyurethane, and then a coat of wax. The next thing we did was we installed soft close hinges because it's going to be used as a toy box. So we want to make sure that little fingers are safe, and the soft close hinges do a very nice job. As it falls, and it's nice and gentle. I found a great online resource to get my hinges, and they are not sponsoring me, but I do want to give them credit. The name of the company is called The Hardware Source. And the first hinge I bought was identified as a toy box hinge. So I bought it, I installed it, but it wasn't a soft close. It just held the hinge up. So I reached out to the customer service. They answered the phone right away, got a very knowledgeable associate, and he recommended some soft close bench stays. So they are 2 sets of hinges that sit on either side. And as you saw earlier, they just soft close down to protect those little fingers. So now I'm going to wrap this up, bring it to the customer. And a little bit of background. So we had about just under 24 hours worth of work on this, not including the time that was spent sitting in clamps trying to get the cups out of the boards. But I think it came out pretty well. I hope the customer likes it as much as I do. And I appreciate you watching the video. Thank you.